Alright, so the paint appears to be dry here the next day on this back hatch. I am going to work next on fabricating that hatch there. When I said the paint's dry, I meant on the bench, not the hatch. I'll be fabricating a hinged hatch there. I went to the auto supply store, O'Reilly's, and got some gasketing material. This is a automotive gasket for that hatch, as well as some thicker stuff for this doorway, so that when we install this door here, we have a good seal against the metal frame that will go in place here, that metal frame there that's currently resting on the pile of scrap metal. So I need to finish fabricating that frame as well and get that door in place. So I don't have time to do all that today, but those are the next steps. Okay, so I'm back at the bus here this evening. Gonna figure out this back hatch, running through thoughts in my head of where I want to hinge it, how I want to build it, trying to think of whether I want a shelf on it or not. I'm going to be using this yellow steel tubing. I'm going to chop it up as needed to kind of recycle that metal into this back hatch, and possibly a storage rack on that hatch. This hatch isn't going to get open very often. As I mentioned before, it's really, my thought process is to be able to get full-size mattress or king-size mattress in and out of the bus. We don't intend to use memory foam. We like hotel mattresses, and the one we like needs the box spring to be the most comfortable. So anyhow, that's why I'm building the back hatch. But just thinking through the plan, I'm going to start cutting metal and tacking it up. I don't know how far I'll get today. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here is cut some metal to serve as like a flat flange where the hatch can basically rest against that to make it watertight. I'm going to rivet that in place and caulk it in place to that yellow piece, and I'll do the same over on this side. So I'll take some measurements and cut that scrap metal, and then I'll start fabricating the hatch accordingly. Measuring for a king-size mattress here, I basically have about an inch of extra space to play with between the two sides. So I'm going to want the flange to stick out about a ½ an inch on each side, just enough to put the weather stripping in. Alright, so here I'm cutting some scrap metal I removed from somewhere in the bus, I can't even remember where. Cutting this to serve as the backer for those sides. It's going to get tack welded in the bottom and riveted from the inside along the 3/16 rivets for that yellow tubing. What I'm doing right now is just grinding up that excess sheet metal to make it flush, so that I can mount that piece of metal trim over here, and then I'll tack weld it at the bottom there and at the top here, and throw a couple rivets along this bar. That'll give the hatch something to close into with the seal. Alright, so I have this placed. Now I'm going to drill some holes, and then I'll put caulk behind and rivet that. Then I'm going to tack weld here, and then I'll put a bead of caulk in the corner to keep water from infiltrating. Okay, so I've got the rivet holes drilled here in that yellow bar and that piece of metal. Now I'm going to put a little caulk along that, close to the right hand side there, so it beads over into the corner, and get some rivets in those rivet holes, some 3/16. Got to hook up the airline and the rivet gun, but that'll put that sheet metal in place. I'll do the other side similarly, and then I'll get the welder and tack that sheet metal in place on the angle irons. Alright, so I got a nice thick bit of caulk on that side. Now I'm going to rivet this in place. Alright, so I have that strip of metal riveted in place. And now I'm going to clamp up here in the corners and just tack the weld bead around that 1/2 inch. I'll do it dot by dot, so to speak, so that it doesn't melt the metal. But actually first I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, then I'll do the welding, since I don't have it hooked up yet. Okay, so this side's also trimmed out. You can see from the other side here what I'm doing. Hopefully you can see that in the view. So I'll put some caulk in the corner, spread it, and then I'll do some tack welds. After that I'll be ready to lay out the frame for the hatch. Okay, so out here you can see I've got the Sikaflex spread into that corner on both sides. I'll clean up the excess with the wire wheel before I mount the weatherproofing seal. But the idea here is to keep water out of that crack where the skin sheet metal there meets the angle iron. This will get primed and painted before final assembly. Now I've got to start measuring and mocking up the frame that will fill that space. So I'm going to take some measurements of the rough opening. I'll leave an 1/8 inch gap where the seal is going to go. That'll be up against the angle iron here, along with in here in the top, all the way around, sort of a square of fairly thin weather stripping made of rubber that I got at the auto parts store. Got about 20 feet of it. Alright, so I'm going to start cutting metal here. So right here I've drilled out the 3/16 rivets that were holding these two angle irons together. These were tack welded later, so they're not going to separate. But the reason for that is I need a place to get the hinge installed, and the rivets will interfere with that. Alright, so I'm back at the bus. I cut another piece going lengthwise across the back, and a couple of these side pieces. I'm going to notch these so I can weld them such that this surface is flush with the bottom and top rails. So I'm using this monster vise out here, and I'm going to get the grinder and clean this up so that I can mate that to the other angle iron at a right angle. So I'll do that to two pieces of the side pieces here, then we'll tack those in place, and that'll be the outer edge of the hatch in the back. Alright, so I've got this set up to tack in the welder. Looks like pretty good fit. You can see I made it so it's flush. I think what I'm going to do is weld this side first from the inside before welding the corners. That way I can make sure that they're flush looking at it while I'm welding. So anyhow, I'm going to get at it. I got to get the welder set up. Okay, so I moved the bus a bit to make this welding extension cord reach to the back. So I'm about to tack this up here in the back. Just got to connect the welder and put the helmet and gloves on. Okay, so I'm getting ready to weld here. Let's see if I can set the camera up to capture it, since I don't have anybody in here with me. Let's see if I can lean it a little bit and let it catch the view. It may work. I did disconnect the battery to the bus before starting, by the way. I always do with welding on the bus. Okay. Okay, so I've got tacks put in that corner and that corner. These are going to get pulled off and grounded or ground down after I'm done with the basic fabrication. Okay, now that that's tacked from the inside, I'm going to do the outside. I'm going to weld the zigzag here, 1, 2, 3 over on the top and bottom. And then I'll do that on the other side as well. After that, I'll take this frame out and I'll be putting pieces of this yellow metal into it in the center to provide support. Okay, it's ugly, but it'll hold. Okay, so the weld's still smoking there. I've got it tacked up enough. This frame can now be unclamped and taken back out. Okay, so I've pulled that frame out of the hatch opening. Now I'm going to cut some pieces of this square tubing or rectangular tubing to fit vertically here, short ways on the frame, and that'll give it strength once those are tacked in place. I'm going to grind down these welds a little bit so that I can put one of those fairly close to the end on each side. But that'll be next, taking a measurement and cutting the yellow pieces. All right, so I've got the first yellow piece tacked into place, and I'll do one on this end next, and then a couple in the middle. But I think I'm finished for the evening. Okay, so we're back at the bus here. Trying to, since it's raining, I'm working on the door frame to make sure it's square. It's not quite square. The door has a little bit of extra slop inside of it in 2 corners, so we're going to grind out a weld that appears to have cracked here and redo it. And I think I'm going to set the door in the middle before I tack it to make sure it's exactly the way I want it. Okay, so back at the bus here, still working on closing things up. I've got the side door. What I've done here is I'm using 3/4 angle iron with the 1.5" angle iron. I've got it clamped in place. This is going to serve to stop the door. I'm going to make an inside 3/4 frame all the way around to stop the door when it closes, and to form backing for the weatherproofing seal. And that'll be all the way around like that. And that way we'll get a nice weatherproof setup going on here. But right now I'm going to hit it with the grinder wheel to create some weldable surface, and then we'll tack it for now, and then we'll run beads all the way around with the welder. I'll have to control heat here so it doesn't distort, but for right now I'm just going to tack some small beads as I fabricate this. Okay, so I've got this tacked into place. This 3/4 angle up against the 1.5" angle. So that's held at a right angle based on the clamping that I did. And now we'll do the other side over here, same way, and then the other 2 surfaces. Okay, so I have this other side tacked in place, and I have a piece of metal cut to put in at the top here. This is actually the top of the door, so we'll get that tacked in. I might need to trim it up a little bit more, but I think that might be about it for today. Okay, so I have that segment tacked into place against the 2x2 tubing. So I can flip this around real quick and show the results, then I'm going to take off for the day. Okay, so I flipped this frame around. You can see this is actually the top of the door, but you can see I've got that 3/4 of channel all the way around. That's where my weather stripping in the back of the door is going to seat. This one up here will be at the bottom. I'm going to weld that piece after I've laid the door down on that channel there, and I'll weld the door into that channel as well. So that's why I haven't put that piece on yet. I'm going to put a gap and weld all 3 pieces of metal together is the plan. Well, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, I've got that tacked in place. I'll finish running a bead around, grind it, clean it up. Yeah, I probably will put this in ahead of time, I guess. I guess I can just weld the bottom of the two parts, or I don't know. I'm still thinking through. But that's it for today. Okay, so I'm back at the bus here. I've fabricated this piece of, or cut the notches on this piece of 3/4 angle iron. I'm going to slot that in right in here and weld it up. Whoop. A little hard to do with one hand there. I'm going to weld that up like so. I'm going to clamp it and get it tacked. After that, I will be welding this all the way around so that we have the door seal for the weather seal. After that, I'll be painting this door and putting a coat of paint on the outside here behind where the door is going to go. And I got some screws to remove and a little bit of cutting to do outside to make sure this fits flush at the bottom. Okay, so I have that piece tacked in place. And from here, I'm going to use a wire brush to clean things up. And I'm going to groove these pieces of metal a little bit. And my goal will be to get a seam going all the way around them so that they're waterproof. Alright, so I'm about ready to weld the bead here uphill in this groove to waterproof this side, and then I'll continue all the way around that way. Okay, so at this point I've got a bead all the way around the outside, and I've spot welded along the inside. I'm going to grind this stuff down. This inside little crack I'm going to fill with Sikaflex before I paint after grinding, just to ensure that it's watertight. So the whole reason to do this channel here is to make sure the door has something to seal against. Alright, so I finished welding this. Now I'm going to hit it with the grinder, smooth things out, get the weld bead smoothed out. Then any spots that are still seams will get, like I said, Sikaflex put into it, let that dry, and then we'll, that's paintable. So after that I'll re-prime and paint this. Okay, so I've been grinding at the welding bead. It's taken a while, but I'll get it. But tonight, well, I'm done for tonight actually is what I'm trying to say. I'm going to pack up and head home here. Okay, so I'm back at the bus. The doorway here appears to have shrunk a little bit. I had to grind about 1/4 inch off the top. I actually think it's because I put these caps on both sides. They overlapped almost 1/8. So I'm going to try to dry fit the door into the frame at this point and see if it fits. If not, I'll have to do a little more grinding. Okay. We've got the door resting in with a clamp here, and you can see it's still a tight fit. I've been grinding and grinding here trying to get the excess weld bead off and whatnot. I got a little bit more to go here on the side of the bus opening here, up in here, to get this to clear. After that I'll take it down, clean up spot welds on the inside, and I'll be painting the door frame. I'll hit it with some spray primer and some white spray paint for now, and we'll get that thing dry fit, and then I'll work on the permanent fastening of the frame into the door. Okay, at this point I've got the door dry fit into the frame, and I'm intending to use this piece of angle iron. It'll be caulked in and riveted in to kind of block rain from getting in. These corners will get extra caulk, quite a lot of extra caulk, and then there'll be a facing of bent sheet metal on the outside to act as sort of a drip edge at the top. Similarly, I may put a piece of sheet metal as a deflector on the outside. I've got to look at that to kind of keep water from being driven through the door when we're driving. you know, with the wind. But there will be weather stripping on this flange, and the door will close against that. Now it's time to clean this up with the wire wheel and make these spot welds on the interior, like these here, if you can see them. That one there's a better example. Clean those up flush, wire wheel, and then spray prime and paint outside. Then we'll start fastening this door frame to the outside. Okay, so I've been grinding up this outside a little bit. I'm going to put a piece of sheet metal in here now. I'll be putting spray foam in behind it and all the way over. And I'll do that from the other side. I have a gap there. But right now I'm going to hit this with some more primer, and then we'll measure for sheet metal. Okay, so I don't know if the lighting is very good in the image here, but I've slotted these little bumps, and I've slotted the heads of the screws because they won't come out with a drill. They're rusted too much. So I'm going to hit those with the impact hammer, pneumatic hammer, and then we're going to bend these off and then grind them smooth so that the door frame can set in there. Alright, so I have this cleaned up, hit it with some primer so it won't rust. Now it's time to get the door ground and painted, and then we'll put it back in after the paint's dry. I think I'm going to use riv nuts to fasten it. I'll put probably 3 on this bottom section, and then a couple in here on the sides with 5/16 18 thread riv nuts. Okay, so right now I'm in the middle of putting a coat of primer on the frame. After that I'll put some white paint on it all around, and I'm going to get that sheet metal in below the door as the next step. Alright, so I am in the middle of putting a coat of white paint on this door frame. It's just a good neutral color because I don't actually know or haven't bought the paint to paint the outside of the bus yet. So we're going to go with this color for now because it's easy to cover. And so that's painted. Then I'm going to fasten that sheet metal in with some 3/16 rivets. After that, we'll get this frame put in place, and we'll start drilling holes for the riv nuts. Okay, so the plan right now is to use the 3/16 rivets. I'm going to put a few at the top and some at the bottom, and we'll put some Sikaflex in behind this, and then we'll rivet it in place. Alright, so I've got this over here ready to put the door in. Sheet metal in place, riveted in place. Got a coat of paint on it. Next step, I'm going to spray foam behind there while the door is still drying over here inside the bus. Once the door is dry enough, I'm going to clamp it in place, and then I'm going to drill 5/16 holes, then take the door off, and then drill 10.5 millimeter holes for the riv nuts. They're going to get put on with this riv nut tool I bought from a rivet supply company. It's got a handle, and then this installation head here. I believe you hold this with the saw or with a wrench and work the hex head handle to pull the riv nut together. Okay, so I'm still waiting for the paint to dry. I decided to start welding up the back hatch. Got some pieces cut, so I'm going to put these uprights in. Okay, so I have this back hatch welded up. I think I'm going to hit it with the grinder where the beads are, and I'll get this primed and painted outside the bus. Check the paint here. It's still just a little bit tacky, so I'm going to continue working on this for now. Okay, so I got this welded up last night. Got a coat of paint on it for the back hatch, and the top there has been reinforced so that the hinge can be connected to it. That should be plenty strong to support some sheet metal. And at this point I'm going to put it in place, and I've got some things spacing it at the bottom. I just took a spent cutoff wheel and broke it in half to kind of space the bottom. There's one there, there's one over here. I'm going to put it in place and then clamp it in place, and we'll see how the hinge fits up at the top. It may actually be smarter of me to do the hinge at the bottom. I have to think about that. Okay, so I went ahead and also clamped this door jamb in place. I've got it clamped at the bottom because that surface is a right angle. It's going to angle out as it goes up, and then I'm going to have to fabricate some trim pieces for the edges to help with the waterproofing on the outside. And then up at the top there's going to be angle iron along with some sheet metal on the outside to help protect from water. But for now we're going to get the bottom set up with the 5/16 bolts and rib nuts so that this door frame would actually still be removable in the future. Alright, so I have the back hatch frame clamped in place. The next step will be to get the hinge connected. Right here at the bottom, I decided to hinge it at the bottom. I'm going to have to space this bottom out a little bit, I believe, to get the hinge to work properly. But hinging it at the bottom will help as far as making it easier when we want to load stuff. We won't have the risk of the thing falling on somebody's head as we're loading. So we'll just prop it up with a piece of wood as we load off the ground. All right, so once this gets covered in sheet metal, the hinge will be placed at the bottom like that. This is a stainless steel hinge that I got off of Amazon. So I have to cover this in 18 gauge sheet metal. Before I do that, I think I want to, well, maybe not before, but at some point I'm going to reclad this starting from the bottom, fixing this dent by covering it up. I'm going to bend metal around the corner. I will rivet it using these holes here and tuck in behind here, and then I'll start another sheet overlapping at this point right here, going down the whole bottom. We're going to put a strip of metal in. It's going to have a little bit of a lip to help direct water over the engine bay edge here, and then I'll keep moving sheet metal up and covering that. I don't know if I'm going to reuse the windows over here. I've got to look at the holes. I might use them as a template to cut metal, but there was some rust holes in one of these two at least. Yeah, there it is right there. There's a rust hole there. So, you know, it's more likely I'm just going to use it as a basic template for the shape, because I think we're going to have storage where these windows were anyway. But that's where we're at. Dealing with a little bit of a problem. The electrical breaker keeps popping. There's something wrong with shop electric. My brother added a welding outlet, and I think something got screwed up. We keep propping the breaker every time I go to work here. So it might be all I can do today. Okay, so thinking through my plan here, I'm test fitting this piece of angle iron to space out the hinge, and it would actually kind of seal the door from rain. I'm envisioning having to be doing something in the engine bay in the middle of a downpour at some point. This would maybe help me keep rain from dripping down in through the crack here. I know that's an issue from working on that turbocharger two or so years ago when I got the bus and it was raining and I kept getting soaked. So anyhow, that would probably work, having an angle iron piece be the spacer for the hinge and to sort of act to cushion the door, stop the door from going too high. I think that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I have the 5/16 holes drilled. Now I'm going to take the frame off and I'll change the drill bit for the larger 10.5 millimeter that fits the riv nuts. After that I will install the riv nuts and then I'll be able to bolt the door into place through these front holes. Okay, so now I have these holes widened for the rivet nuts and I'll be installing those here in a minute. Alright, so this is a rivet nut, nut-cert, or a riv nut. People call them different things. The idea is it acts to be like the nut on the bolt, but it gets pinched like a rivet into the metal so that you don't have to hold the back end of the bolt later with anything. And this is useful for this spot because there isn't much clearance. And if I ever need to take the door off, I want it to be easy. So, and it also allows me to finish that surface and not have to worry about trying to access it later. So that's the biggest reason. It's also the reason I'm going to be using closed rivet nuts. Closed meaning this open end here will be sealed off. I have those inside the bus. I'll be using closed rivet nuts on the roof to mount the solar panel rack, and probably also our lounging net. We're going to use a sailboat net above the master bedroom instead of a deck. Okay, so I'm tapping these in with a hammer, after which I will crush them, bring them into a compression with that tool, which will pinch them tight from the back. You'll see a bead right here that's just flat. You'll see it bead up on the back side when we're done with the tool. Box end wrench. We have the device that does the riv nuts. I'm going to thread that in as far as it'll go. All right, and we'll thread this one in. And the idea here is I'm going to hold that. This box end wrench is going to tighten the riv nut. Okay, so as you can see, this got crushed up against the back by that tool. So this riv nut is now secure. Okay, so I've got these riv nuts in. I've got bolts threaded into them to make sure that the bolts thread just fine. I did learn that it's much easier to use the riv nut insert tool if you put the riv nut on the tool first, then tap it into the hole so that it doesn't spin when you're trying to put it on the tool with nowhere to grab it with pliers. So just a little tip, put the riv nut on the tool first. And this is a different style of tool. There's one with 2 arms that you can buy as well. I think that might be an easier tool, I'm not sure, but anyhow, put the riv nut on the tool first. At this point, I'm going to take these bolts back out. I'm going to use Sikaflex on the sill, and I'm going to put this door in place. Okay, so I have the door jamb fastened at the bottom. These 7 bolts will hold it. And at the top, I'm going to use rivets with angle iron to kind of hold that at the top. There may be some support from the inside at the door jamb on each side. I have to look at how I want to do that, but it's probably just going to be tack welded at those sides there. But we'll see what happens, how I do it. Maybe it'll be rivets. But anyhow, I've got it in place. I've got the bottom caulked. I've got it caulked up far enough that I can put more caulk in. So this was going to be too narrow, so I went and extended the line up a little bit. But it's in place. I'm pleased with this result. So we're good to go here. So Mother Nature has some other ideas today. Alright, so I'm going to use angle iron on the inside and outside to close that gap. After I dry fit it, I'm going to caulk it, and then I'll use 1/4-inch bolts and nuts to fasten it in place. And that'll be sealed with the caulk. Okay, so the rain picked back up, but I've got these holes drilled right now through this piece and through the sheet metal skin above the door. The next step will be to get the other piece of angle iron in the right position on the other side and finish drilling these holes. One thing I didn't mention is that I used this clamp here to adjust the outside gap between the angle iron and the wall of the bus at the top. Alright, so I have the holes drilled through both pieces of angle iron and the sheet metal skin. At this point, I'm going to wait for the rain to die down a little bit, and then I'm going to caulk both pieces of sheet metal and this one, although it would probably be better if I tack welded this, but I'm not able to do it right now due to the electrical issues we're having. Okay, so I got the angle iron bolted, riveted in place. You'll notice little tiny pinholes of daylight there. I've got to caulk in and out for those. I am going to weld a couple little beads here to secure this inner angle iron to the door. Can't do that today, but after I tack those beads in, I'll be running a bead of caulk at the bottom of this angle iron as well. So the goal here being total water tightness, even with the wind of driving. Okay, so I put a corner brace in, little piece of angle iron. I'll have to find another little angle iron trimming for the other side, but a couple of rivets just to stiffen up the top of the door a bit more for when it's closed. That should be sufficient, and we'll do one on the other side similar, so that should be fairly strong. Alright, so I've got another little piece of angle at the top here on this side to support a couple of rivets. So between the two it'll be rigid, and then we're still going to tack a bead here where I ground out some paint once the welder's able to get some power. Okay, so I'm trying to fit the door, and it looks like when I welded, the metal frame bowed in just a little bit on the one side, just enough to cause it to be tight. Okay, so what I did here is cut some pieces of wood and tap them in place to help spread the metal. I think I'm going to have no other choice but to just weld the strip of metal in behind the door here to hold it in place on each side. Okay, so my project today, part of it is to clean up this pavilion where I had painted the metal. That's the sheet of metal that'll go on the back hatch, among other places. I'm going to cut that up today. But I'm also building a cutting table and organizing my debris from the bus, trying to make sure that we can use this pavilion for the family get-togethers for the summertime here. So we have the wood-fired pizza oven over there. So anyhow, you know, it's not all building. There's a lot of cleanup and organization and moving things around that goes into bus build. Okay, so I've tidied up the pavilion so that we have some space for hanging out in the shade. Got it cleaned up where all the bus stuff was. And this will become our cutting table for all the interior build. Got the pallet the wood was delivered on. I don't know if I showed this before in another video, but we have a construction junction locally. It's kind of like Habitat for Humanity Restore. And I got a bunch of solid wood trim here in that mahogany color, and I also got this wood composite interlocking flooring for quite a bargain. So that'll be part of what we use as build materials. I'm going to use some dark colors, and then for the floor and trim and the walls I'm looking walls and cabinets, I'm leaning towards lighter colors. But anyway, I also got the bus moved because we're having electrical problems with that red building. This shop building now has a welding outlet, so the bus is moved closer so I can do the welding I need to do. So now I'm going to start working on the bus. Okay, so I've started welding in some plate metal to try to pull that door frame where it needs to be. I took measurements from the outside and adjusted clamps accordingly. So I'll put a few more in going up here, but I'm out of time for today.